March 22, 1945. 0347 hours. Oppenheim, Germany. Major General Manton Eddy stood in the basement of a demolished brewery, staring at a document that had arrived by courier 20 minutes earlier. The orders were typed on plain paper, bore no official letterhead, and were signed only with the initials G.S.P. 3 pages that contradicted every tactical doctrine the United States Army had published since 1943. 3 pages that, if followed, would either end the war in Europe or destroy his entire corps. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The radio operator sat motionless in the corner, pretending not to exist. He had decoded the message himself, recognized immediately what it meant, and understood that his life expectancy depended entirely on forgetting everything he had just read. Outside, the sound of German artillery crashed against American positions along the Rhine. Inside this concrete tomb that smelled of hops and cordite, Eddy held orders that would commit 12,000 men to an assault that staff planners at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force had explicitly forbidden. The document was elegant in its brevity. Cross at Oppenheim. Maximum force. Maximum speed. Ignore flanks. Acknowledge by action only. The implications were staggering. Patton was ordering a major river crossing without air support, without adequate bridging equipment, without the weeks of preparation that doctrine required. More critically, he was ordering it against a section of the Rhine defended by the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, a formation that had earned its reputation through 5 years of brutal efficiency on both eastern and western fronts. Das Reich was not merely another German division. It was Hitler's fire brigade. The unit rushed to crisis points when the line was breaking. Its soldiers wore the lightning bolt runes of the Waffen SS. They had stopped Soviet offensives at Kursk, crushed Allied paratroopers at Arnhem, and held Normandy together during the weeks after D-Day when the entire German position should have collapsed. Intelligence estimated Das Reich at 60% strength, approximately 12,000 effectives, equipped with 40 operational Panther tanks and dug into positions that had been fortified since January. Eddy walked to the map table where his operations officer had marked German positions in red. The Rhine at Oppenheim was 300 yards wide, running fast with spring melt from the Alps. The eastern bank rose steeply, providing natural observation points that made conventional crossings suicidal. Das Reich held every village, every treeline, every road intersection for 5 miles inland. Their artillery was registered on every possible landing site. Their machine guns had overlapping fields of fire that turned the river into a killing zone. Standard doctrine called for a 3-to-1 advantage in attacking forces. Eddy would be crossing at numerical parity against enemies who had been preparing for this moment since the Americans reached the Rhine in early March. The strategic situation made Patton's order comprehensible even if not rational. 50 miles north, Montgomery was preparing Operation Plunder, a massive Rhine crossing involving over 1 million men, thousands of aircraft, and enough supplies to sustain a small nation. Montgomery's methodical approach had consumed 6 weeks of preparation. Eisenhower had concentrated Allied resources on making Plunder succeed. Every spare division, every available tank, every artillery piece that could be spared had been shifted north. Patton's Third Army had been relegated to secondary status, holding positions but not expected to conduct major operations. This situation was intolerable to George Patton. While Montgomery accumulated forces and refined plans, Patton saw opportunities slipping away. Every day spent preparing allowed Germans to strengthen defenses and reposition reserves. Every conference that delayed crossing gave the enemy time to recover from the catastrophic defeats of winter. Patton believed, with the certainty that characterized all his tactical decisions, that speed and aggression could accomplish what caution and preparation could not. Eddy understood Patton's thinking because he had served under him since North Africa. Patton operated on principles that academic officers found troubling but that combat repeatedly validated. Attack constantly. Never give enemies time to prepare. Accept risks that prudent commanders would reject. Move faster than opponents could react. These principles had carried Third Army from Normandy to the Rhine in 8 months, liberating more territory and destroying more German divisions than any other Allied formation. But crossing the Rhine against Das Reich without adequate support was not aggressive. It was potentially catastrophic. The river crossing itself would consume hours, during which assault boats would be vulnerable to artillery and machine gun fire. Once across, infantry would need to establish a bridgehead large enough to protect engineers constructing a tactical bridge capable of supporting armor. That bridgehead would face immediate counterattack by SS Panzer forces. Without air support to suppress German artillery, without enough boats to get sufficient infantry across quickly, without bridging equipment to bring armor over before Das Reich concentrated for counterattack, the operation could produce casualties on a scale Third Army had never experienced. Eddy's operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, stood near the map table with an expression that conveyed everything he dared not say aloud. Webb had graduated from West Point in 1936, studied military history with obsessive detail, and could cite chapter and verse from every manual the Army had published on river crossings. He knew that what Patton was ordering violated every principle those manuals taught. He also knew that Webb had been present at the staff conference 6 days earlier when Eisenhower's chief of staff had explicitly stated that Third Army would conduct no major operations until Montgomery's crossing was complete. The radio operator shifted slightly in his chair, a movement small enough to be involuntary but significant enough to remind everyone that witnesses existed. Eddy made his decision with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through 2 world wars. He walked to the radio, picked up the handset, and spoke 4 words to the division commanders waiting for his response. "Execute immediately." Radio silence. 23 minutes later, at 0410 hours, engineers from the 1318th Engineer Combat Battalion began carrying assault boats toward the Rhine. They moved in darkness through ruins of Oppenheim, a medieval town that American artillery had reduced to rubble during the previous week. The boats were wooden, 16 feet long, capable of carrying 12 men across current that would push them hundreds of yards downstream during the crossing. Each boat weighed 400 pounds. Engineers would carry them 300 yards from hiding positions to the riverbank, launch them under fire, and then wait to repeat the process when the first wave needed extraction or reinforcement. The plan that Eddy's staff had assembled in 90 minutes was elegant through sheer simplicity. The 5th Infantry Division would cross first, 2 regiments side by side, aiming for landing zones 1,500 yards apart. Speed was everything. Get enough infantry across to establish firing positions before Das Reich could react. Suppress German artillery observers. Hold long enough for engineers to construct a floating bridge. Pray that armor could cross before SS Panzers arrived in strength. Intelligence on Das Reich positions was remarkably detailed despite the division's reputation for security. Aerial reconnaissance had identified their main defensive line, artillery positions, and probable locations of panzer forces held in reserve. German routine was predictable. They rotated frontline units every 4 days. March 22 was the 2nd day of the current rotation, meaning frontline troops would be alert but not yet exhausted. Das Reich officers favored aggressive patrolling. American positions had been probed constantly for 2 weeks. But aggressive patrolling meant German attention was focused forward, toward American lines, not on their own rear areas where crossing preparation might be detected. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The German commander opposite Eddy's position was SS Standartenführer Heinrich Voss, a career officer who had joined the SS in 1934 and commanded Das Reich elements in Poland, France, and Russia. Voss was 41 years old, holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, and possessed a reputation for tactical flexibility unusual in SS officers. He understood that defending river lines was fundamentally problematic. Defenders had to be strong everywhere because they could not predict where attackers would cross. Attackers could concentrate forces at a single point, achieving local superiority even when outnumbered overall. Voss's solution was mobility. He kept minimal forces on the riverbank itself, positioned where they could observe and report but not strong enough to defeat a serious crossing attempt. His main strength was positioned 2 to 3 kilometers inland, concentrated around the villages of Dienheim and Guntersblom, located on high ground with excellent observation and multiple routes toward the river. When Americans attempted to cross, forward observers would report the location. Voss would then concentrate forces at that point, hitting the bridgehead before it could be reinforced. This doctrine had worked repeatedly on the Eastern Front where Soviet crossings were crushed through rapid counterattack. What Voss did not know, could not have known, was that Eddy had no intention of establishing a conventional bridgehead. Patton's orders had been clear. Cross at maximum speed. Ignore flanks. These were not instructions for establishing a defensive perimeter. They were orders for a breakout, for punching through German lines and driving inland before Das Reich could organize coherent resistance. The plan accepted enormous risk. American forces would cross the Rhine with exposed flanks, without adequate supply lines, racing inland while German forces were still capable of counterattacking. It was fundamentally insane by conventional standards. It was also exactly the kind of operation at which Patton's Third Army excelled. At 0422 hours, the first assault boats touched water. Engineers launched them in near silence, pushing off from a riverbank where buildings provided some concealment from German observation. The 11th Infantry Regiment led the crossing, 2 battalions committed in the first wave, 1,200 men whose survival depended on reaching the opposite bank before Das Reich realized what was happening. Each boat carried 12 riflemen, their weapons wrapped in canvas against spray, their ammunition distributed to minimize losses if a boat was hit. They rowed in darkness across current that pulled them steadily downstream, each crew aiming for a point 500 yards upstream from their intended landing to compensate for drift. German sentries on the opposite bank saw nothing. The night was moonless, overcast, with visibility measured in yards rather than hundreds of meters. River noise masked the sound of oars. American artillery had been firing harassing missions all night, random shells impacting across Das Reich's rear area, so the continued sound of explosions created no alarm. By 0441 hours, when the first boat grounded on the eastern bank, nearly 300 American soldiers were on the water without German forces registering the threat. The landing was chaos by design. Boats grounded wherever current carried them, infantry scrambling ashore and immediately pushing inland. No attempt was made to organize formal units. Squads and platoons that happened to land together moved together. Officers led whoever followed them. The objective was not tactical coherence but speed and violence. Get off the riverbank. Find German positions. Kill or capture defenders before they could report the crossing. Above all, keep moving. Sergeant First Class Robert Callahan of Baker Company, 2nd Battalion, 11th Infantry, landed with 11 men at 0443 hours. They hit the bank running, scrambled up a muddy slope, and encountered a German sentry post 15 seconds later. The ensuing firefight lasted less than a minute. 3 German soldiers died without firing a shot. A 4th escaped into darkness, running toward positions where he could raise the alarm. Callahan's squad pursued but lost him in the ruins of a farmhouse. It no longer mattered. Gunfire had announced the American presence. Das Reich would be responding within minutes. By 0500 hours, approximately 800 American infantrymen had crossed the Rhine and were pushing inland against stiffening resistance. German sentries were engaging everywhere now, falling back toward their main positions while firing at American soldiers who appeared to be everywhere simultaneously. Radio traffic from Das Reich forward observers reported American crossings at multiple points along a 2-kilometer stretch of riverbank. This confused German response because doctrine said attackers would concentrate at a single crossing site. Multiple crossings suggested either reconnaissance in force or a poorly coordinated main attack. Either way, Voss needed to determine American intentions before committing his panzers. What Voss did not understand was that multiple crossing points were accidental rather than planned. Strong current had dispersed boats across a much wider front than intended. This accident was creating precisely the confusion Patton's plan required. Das Reich was seeing American infantry appearing across their entire frontage, making it impossible to determine where the main effort was occurring. Voss needed information. He ordered his forward units to engage and delay while reconnaissance elements determined American strength and direction of advance. This order bought Americans exactly what they needed most: time. Every minute Das Reich spent observing was a minute when more boats were crossing, when the bridgehead was expanding, when American infantry were pushing deeper into German positions. By 0530, more than 1,500 Americans were across the Rhine. The 11th Infantry Regiment had penetrated nearly a mile inland in some sectors. They were taking casualties from German defensive fire but maintaining momentum through sheer aggression in numbers. German positions designed to channel attackers into killing zones were being bypassed or overwhelmed through tactics that amounted to controlled chaos. At 0547 hours, Voss received the report that forced his decision. American infantry had captured Arnhem, the village that anchored the northern end of his defensive line. More critically, they were not consolidating defensive positions but continuing to advance toward Guntersblum. This was not bridgehead establishment. This was a breakout attempt. Voss immediately ordered his Panzer battalion to counterattack toward Arnhem with orders to destroy American penetration and restore the line. The panzers began moving at 0554. 41 armored vehicles, a mix of Panther medium tanks and Panzer IV mediums, supported by mechanized infantry and half-tracks. They moved in column formation along the road from Guntersblum toward Arnhem, expecting to hit disorganized American infantry who would break when confronted with armor. What they encountered instead was a carefully prepared ambush. Major Harold Benson commanded 1st Battalion, 11th Infantry, the unit that had captured Arnhem. Benson was a 32-year-old officer from Ohio who had been commissioned from ROTC in 1937 and had learned infantry tactics through 2 years of nearly continuous combat. He understood that capturing villages meant nothing if you could not hold them. When his companies secured Arnhem at 0535, Benson immediately positioned his limited anti-tank weapons to cover approaches from the east. He had 3 57mm anti-tank guns, woefully inadequate against Panther armor, and a dozen bazookas that were effective only at close range. His plan was desperation weaponized. The German panzers came down the road at 0612 hours, moving fast because Voss had ordered immediate action. The lead Panther was 300 yards from Arnhem when Benson's 57mm guns opened fire. All 3 rounds hit. All 3 ricocheted off frontal armor without penetrating. But they accomplished what Benson needed. They stopped the column. Panzers halted while commanders assessed the threat, trying to locate American positions. That brief pause allowed American bazooka teams to close range. What followed was slaughter at intimate distance. American infantry rose from positions in rubble and destroyed German vehicles from 50 yards. The lead Panther took 3 bazooka rounds in its side armor and exploded. The second tank tried to reverse and struck the vehicle behind it. Both were destroyed by infantry who swarmed them from concealment. German mechanized infantry attempted to deploy but were caught in the open by rifle fire from buildings they had assumed were empty. The entire column was stalled on a single road with burning vehicles at the front and American infantry on both flanks. The engagement lasted 18 minutes. When German survivors retreated at 0630, they left behind 23 destroyed vehicles and approximately 200 casualties. Benson's battalion had lost 17 killed and 43 wounded. The exchange rate was devastating but not unusual for well-executed ambushes against armor in close terrain. What mattered strategically was that Das Reich's immediate counterattack had failed. The bridgehead was holding. American reinforcements were still crossing. And German commanders now understood they faced something far more serious than a reconnaissance in force. At 3rd Army headquarters in Luxembourg, George Patton stood before a map of Germany with a slight smile that his staff had learned meant satisfaction rather than humor. He had received Eddy's acknowledgement at 0415. And had known immediately that the crossing was underway. No subsequent reports had arrived because radio silence was absolute. But Patton needed no reports. He understood that once forces were committed, outcome was determined by preparation and execution. Eddy was competent. The troops were experienced. Das Reich was dangerous but predictable. The crossing would succeed or fail based on factors already in motion. All Patton could do was wait and prepare to exploit success. That preparation had been underway for days despite Eisenhower's directive limiting Third Army operations. Patton had accumulated bridging equipment through creative logistics that his staff referred to as acquisition rather than requisition. Treadway bridge sections that were supposedly in maintenance had been positioned near Oppenheim. Engineer units that were officially reorganizing after winter fighting had been quietly moved forward. Tank battalions that were ostensibly refitting had full fuel loads and combat-ready status. If the infantry could establish a bridgehead, Patton had everything needed to exploit it. He simply had not informed Supreme Headquarters that these preparations existed. This approach to military procedure was characteristic of Patton's command style. He believed that senior commanders existed to provide resources and set objectives. How those objectives were accomplished was the field commander's responsibility. If higher headquarters imposed restrictions that prevented mission accomplishment, then those restrictions should be interpreted creatively or ignored entirely. This philosophy had nearly ended his career multiple times. It had also made Third Army the most effective American formation in Europe. At 0645 hours, engineers completed the first tactical bridge across the Rhine at Oppenheim. The structure was temporary, rated for infantry and light vehicles only, but it transformed the tactical situation. Reinforcements could now cross in minutes rather than the hours required for boat transfers. By 0700, the entire 11th Infantry Regiment was across along with most of the 10th Infantry. Nearly 4,000 American soldiers were east of the Rhine, holding positions that extended 3 miles inland along a 5-mile front. The bridgehead was shallow, chaotic, and vulnerable. It was also expanding with every passing minute. Voss understood that his initial counterattack had failed and that conventional tactics were now inadequate. He needed to concentrate his remaining panzers for a massed assault that would split the American bridgehead before it could be reinforced with armor. But concentrating forces required time. His units were dispersed across multiple defensive positions. Moving them to assembly areas, coordinating the attack, ensuring adequate infantry support to protect tanks from American bazooka teams, all of this consumed hours. Hours during which Americans were bringing more forces across the Rhine. The situation Voss faced was the nightmare of any defensive commander. He had to attack immediately to prevent American consolidation, but attacking without adequate preparation risked losing his remaining armor in piecemeal engagements. He had to concentrate forces to achieve breakthrough, but concentrating required withdrawing units from positions that were already under American pressure. Every decision involved accepting risk, every option contained the potential for disaster. This was precisely the situation Patton's aggressive crossing had been designed to create. At 0815 hours, Voss committed his forces to a coordinated counterattack aimed at Dienheim and Gundersblum, intending to split the American bridgehead along its center. He assembled 18 Panthers, 12 Panzer IVs, and approximately 1,000 mechanized infantry. The attack would commence at 0930 after artillery preparation. This was sound tactical planning. It was also exactly 1 hour too late. At 0847, American engineers completed a heavy bridge capable of supporting armor. The first M4 Sherman tanks rolled across at 0903. By 0930, when German artillery began preparatory bombardment, 2 American tank battalions were across the Rhine with a third crossing. Approximately 120 Sherman tanks were now in the bridgehead with more arriving continuously. The numerical advantage had shifted decisively. The German counterattack struck at 0945 hours. Panthers and Panzer IVs advanced in company formations with infantry following in half-tracks. They encountered American armor almost immediately and the battle dissolved into a series of company-level engagements fought at ranges where German technical superiority was negated by American numbers. German commanders found themselves fighting multiple enemy units simultaneously. American tank platoons operated independently, moving aggressively, accepting casualties to maneuver into flanking positions. German tanks destroyed multiple Shermans but were overwhelmed by opponents who simply kept coming. Staff Sergeant Thomas Rizzo commanded a Sherman tank in Charlie Company, 37th Tank Battalion. His tank, named Devil's Delight by his crew, crossed the Rhine at 0912 and moved immediately into combat. At 0958, Devil's Delight encountered a Panther at 400 yards. The German tank fired first, penetrating the Sherman's frontal armor and wounding Rizzo's bow gunner. Rizzo's gunner returned fire, his round bouncing off the Panther's glassy plate. Standard tactics called for Shermans to withdraw when engaging Panthers from frontal aspects. Rizzo instead advanced at full speed while his gunner continued firing. The Panther's second shot missed. Devil's Delight closed to 70 yards before the gunner's fourth round penetrated the Panther's side armor. The German tank exploded. This engagement was typical of dozens occurring simultaneously across the bridgehead. American tank crews understood their vehicles were outmatched by German armor in direct fire exchanges. Their solution was aggression in numbers. Accept losses to close range where quantity compensated for quality. The mathematics were brutal but effective. American tank battalions were authorized 63 tanks each with replacement vehicles available. German panzer companies fielded perhaps 10 operational tanks with no replacements possible. Americans could trade losses at 2-1 and still achieve victory. Germans needed to kill 5 or 6 Americans for every loss to maintain parity. They could not sustain that exchange rate. By 10:45 hours, the German counterattack had stalled. Das Reich had lost 21 tanks destroyed, 9 damaged and abandoned, with approximately 400 casualties among mechanized infantry. American losses were 47 tanks destroyed, 23 damaged, with roughly 300 casualties among tank crews and supporting infantry. The exchange ratios favored neither side particularly, but the strategic outcome was decisive. Das Reich had committed its mobile reserves and failed to eliminate the bridgehead. American forces continued to expand their positions and bring additional forces across the Rhine. Voss recognized at this point that he could not restore the situation through available forces. His division had lost nearly half its armor in 3 hours of combat. Infantry units were reporting American penetrations along their entire defensive line. Ammunition was running low, particularly anti-tank rounds. He had 2 options. He could withdraw his remaining forces to secondary defensive positions and attempt to contain American expansion, or he could commit his last reserves in a final attempt to reach the Rhine. Military logic favored withdrawal. SS doctrine favored attack. Voss chose doctrine. At 11:47, Das Reich's final armored reserve, 10 Panthers held in division rear area, received orders to attack toward the Rhine and destroy the American bridges. The mission was nearly impossible. 10 tanks could not break through American positions that had already defeated larger forces. But SS divisions did not refuse orders regardless of probability of success. The Panthers moved forward at 1,205 hours. They never reached the bridges. American fighter bombers appeared at 12:17, 4 P-47 Thunderbolts from 19 Tactical Air Command. The aircraft had been operating in the area, supporting Montgomery's preparations 50 miles north, when a forward air controller with Eddy's corps requested immediate support. The P-47s arrived within minutes and destroyed 8 of the 10 Panthers with rockets and bombs in a single attack pass. The surviving 2 tanks retreated. Das Reich's offensive capability was effectively destroyed. The battle for the Oppenheim bridgehead continued until March 25 as German forces made repeated attempts to contain American expansion. But the outcome was determined in the first 12 hours. By noon on March 22, Patton's gamble had succeeded. The Rhine had been crossed against a premier German formation without the massive preparation that doctrine required. The bridgehead was secure and expanding. Third Army was across Germany's last major water barrier and driving toward the heart of the Reich. Final casualty figures for the Oppenheim crossing recorded 239 Americans killed, 811 wounded, and 47 missing, total of 1,097 casualties. Das Reich losses were estimated at 1,400 killed, 2,300 wounded, and 890 captured, with 64 tanks destroyed. These figures represented approximately 20% of Das Reich's effective strength before the crossing. The division would require complete reconstitution before returning to combat effectiveness. It never received that opportunity. Within 3 weeks, Das Reich would be destroyed in the Ruhr pocket. The strategic implications of Oppenheim extended far beyond a single river crossing. Patton had demonstrated that aggressive action by experienced troops could accomplish objectives that cautious planning said were impossible. He had crossed the Rhine with minimal preparation, defeated an elite German formation, and established a bridgehead that became the launching point for Third Army's drive across southern Germany. Montgomery's carefully prepared Operation Plunder would commence 2 days later on March 24 with massive support and achieve similar results at far greater cost in time and resources. The comparison between Patton's crossing and Montgomery's was inevitable and politically explosive. Patton had violated orders, committed forces without adequate support, and achieved success through calculated risk-taking that senior commanders found troubling. Montgomery had followed doctrine, prepared methodically, and achieved success through overwhelming force. Both approaches worked. But Patton's success in 24 hours with minimal casualties compared to Montgomery's success over days with massive resource commitment raised uncomfortable questions about Allied strategy. Eisenhower's response to Patton's unauthorized crossing was pragmatic. He publicly praised the achievement while privately reprimanding Patton for violating directives. The reprimand was pro forma and both men knew it. Success justified risk. Had the crossing failed, Patton's career would have ended. But it succeeded, so the gamble was reframed as bold leadership. This pattern was characteristic of Patton's relationship with higher command throughout the war. He operated at the edge of what was permissible, occasionally crossed into what was forbidden, and relied on tactical success to absolve procedural violations. For the soldiers who executed the crossing, strategic implications mattered less than survival. They had crossed a major river under fire, fought an elite enemy formation, and held positions that doctrine said were indefensible. They had done this because their commanders ordered it and because they trusted that those orders, however risky, were based on sound tactical judgment. That trust was the foundation of Third Army's effectiveness. Soldiers believed their commanders would not waste their lives through incompetence or caution. The Oppenheim crossing validated that belief. The Germans who faced this assault drew different conclusions. Das Reich veterans who survived reported feeling overwhelmed not by American tactical sophistication but by American material superiority and operational tempo. They described fighting enemies who seemed to accept casualties that German forces would consider catastrophic, who continued attacking after initial assaults failed, who had endless reserves of men and equipment. The Oppenheim crossing confirmed what many German soldiers had concluded by early 1945. They were not losing because of inferior courage or tactical skill. They were losing because they faced an enemy with resources that made victory impossible regardless of fighting quality. The unauthorized nature of Patton's Rhine crossing at Oppenheim represented far more than a single commander's defiance of orders. It illuminated fundamental tensions within Allied command structure that had existed since North Africa and would persist until war's end. These tensions centered on competing philosophies about how modern mechanized warfare should be conducted and what level of risk was acceptable in pursuit of strategic objectives. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force operated under Eisenhower's leadership with a philosophy emphasizing coordinated operations, careful preparation, and minimizing casualties through overwhelming force. This approach reflected both Eisenhower's personal temperament and the political realities of coalition warfare. American public opinion would not tolerate unnecessary losses. British forces were exhausted after 5 years of war and could not sustain heavy casualties. Eisenhower needed to maintain unity among allies whose strategic priorities often conflicted. Caution was not weakness but political necessity. Patton rejected this entire framework. He believed that caution in war was itself a form of recklessness because it allowed enemies time to prepare, recover, and strengthen defenses. He argued that accepting risk and moving aggressively produced fewer casualties overall than methodical approaches that gave opponents opportunity to organize resistance. His philosophy was validated repeatedly by Third Army's performance, which consistently achieved objectives with lower casualty rates than formations operating under more conservative commanders. The philosophical divide extended beyond individual commanders to reflect fundamental questions about military leadership in democratic societies. Should field commanders have autonomy to exploit tactical opportunities even when doing so violated strategic directives? Or should centralized command ensure all operations aligned with comprehensive plans regardless of local conditions? Both approaches had merit. Both produced success under different circumstances. The Oppenheim crossing demonstrated that Patton's approach could work brilliantly when executed by experienced troops against enemies already weakened by months of continuous combat. Understanding why Das Reich failed to stop the crossing requires examining the division's condition in March 1945. Official German records captured after the war revealed that Das Reich was rated at 60% strength, but this figure masked critical weaknesses. The division had been in continuous combat since January with minimal rest and inadequate replacements. Veteran soldiers who had survived campaigns in Russia and France were exhausted. New replacements were increasingly drawn from Luftwaffe ground personnel and Kriegsmarine sailors who lacked infantry training. Equipment maintenance was deteriorating as spare parts became unavailable and skilled mechanics were killed or wounded. More fundamentally, Das Reich suffered from the strategic situation facing all German forces by spring 1945. They were defending on all fronts with no strategic reserves available. Every division that was destroyed or rendered combat ineffective could not be replaced. Losses in armor were particularly catastrophic because Germany no longer possessed industrial capacity to manufacture replacement tanks in meaningful numbers. When Das Reich lost 64 tanks during the Oppenheim fighting, those losses represented months of production that German factories could not achieve while under constant air attack. The tactical defeat at Oppenheim also reflected declining quality in German tactical leadership. Voss was a capable commander operating under impossible constraints. His defensive plan was sound given available forces. His decision to counterattack was doctrinally correct. But his execution revealed the erosion of German military effectiveness that characterized the final months of war. German forces in 1945 lacked the coordination and flexibility that had made them so formidable earlier in the conflict. Unit commanders made predictable decisions because innovation required resources and freedom of maneuver they no longer possessed. American tactical evolution by March 1945 represented years of organizational learning compressed into continuous combat. The soldiers who crossed at Oppenheim were not the same army that had landed in Normandy 10 months earlier. They had developed tactical proficiency through experience that no amount of training could replicate. Infantry companies knew how to coordinate with armor and artillery instinctively. Tank crews understood urban fighting and close-quarters combat against superior German armor. Engineers could construct bridges under fire and maintain equipment under conditions that would have paralyzed less experienced forces. This institutional learning occurred at every level of Third Army. Squad leaders knew how to maneuver under fire and exploit terrain. Platoon commanders could coordinate combined arms at tactical level without waiting for orders. Company and battalion commanders operated with initiative that German officers found remarkable. The decentralized command structure that characterized American forces, often criticized as lacking discipline by European standards, proved extraordinarily effective when combined with experience and adequate resources. The crossing also showcased American logistical superiority that extended far beyond simple material abundance. Third Army's logistics system could support operations at tempo that German planners considered impossible. When Patton ordered the crossing, his supply officers immediately began moving ammunition, fuel, rations, and medical supplies to support expanding operations. This was not improvisation but the execution of plans that anticipated multiple contingencies. American logistics operated on assumption that field commanders would exploit opportunities aggressively and that supply systems needed flexibility to support unpredictable operations. German logistics, by contrast, operated on rigid planning that assumed defensive operations with known supply requirements. When American attacks forced German units to reposition or counterattack, their supply systems frequently failed to adapt. Das Reich's counterattacks at Oppenheim were hampered by ammunition shortages, not because Germany lacked shells but because distribution systems could not deliver them quickly enough to units engaged in mobile operations. This systemic inflexibility reflected years of attritional warfare that had destroyed the German military's operational agility. The role of air power in the Oppenheim crossing deserves examination because it illustrates American combined arms integration. The P-47 Thunderbolts that destroyed Das Reich's final armored reserve were not assigned to support Third Army. They were operating independently when a forward air controller requested assistance. The aircraft arrived within minutes, received target information, and executed their attack with devastating precision. This entire sequence, from request to execution, consumed less than 20 minutes. It represented coordination between ground and air forces that German military could no longer achieve. Luftwaffe presence over the Oppenheim battlefield was minimal to non-existent. German fighter aircraft still existed in March 1945, but fuel shortages, maintenance difficulties, and losses of experienced pilots meant they rarely challenged Allied air superiority. This absence of German air power transformed tactical possibilities for American ground forces. Operations could be conducted in daylight without fear of air attack. Supply columns could move openly. Artillery positions were immune to aerial bombardment. The psychological impact on American soldiers of operating under friendly air supremacy cannot be overstated. They knew that if serious threats emerged, aircraft would respond. German soldiers experienced the inverse reality. They knew that American aircraft could strike at any moment and that Luftwaffe protection was fantasy rather than expectation. This knowledge affected every tactical decision. Movement was restricted to darkness or periods of poor visibility. Concentrating forces invited air attack. The simple act of survival required constant vigilance against threats from above. This psychological burden compounded physical exhaustion and material shortages to create conditions where even elite formations struggled to maintain combat effectiveness. The intelligence dimension of the Oppenheim crossing revealed American signals intelligence capabilities that remained highly classified until decades after war's end. American codebreakers had achieved extraordinary success penetrating German communications at multiple levels. While details of these capabilities were protected through elaborate security procedures, the practical effect was that American commanders frequently possessed detailed knowledge of German positions, strength, and intentions. Patton did not cross the Rhine blindly. He had excellent intelligence indicating Das Reich's dispositions and probable responses. German intelligence services by 1945 were shadows of their former capabilities. The Abwehr had been absorbed into the SS security apparatus following its involvement in anti-Hitler conspiracies. Field intelligence relied primarily on tactical reconnaissance that was increasingly difficult as Allied air superiority restricted German observation. The intelligence failure at Oppenheim was not that Germans failed to detect the crossing but that they could not determine American intentions quickly enough to respond effectively. When Voss received reports of multiple crossing points, he lacked information to assess whether this was a main effort or diversionary attack. This uncertainty delayed his response just long enough to allow American forces to establish positions that could not be eliminated. The technological dimensions of the crossing extended beyond weapons systems to encompass communications, transportation, and engineering capabilities. American radio equipment allowed coordination between units that would have been impossible using German systems. American trucks and half-tracks provided mobility that made rapid reinforcement feasible. American engineering equipment allowed bridge construction at speeds German engineers could not match. These technological advantages were individually modest but collectively decisive. They enabled operational tempo that overwhelmed German defensive capabilities. Personnel policies also contributed to American success in ways rarely acknowledged in traditional military histories. American replacement system, often criticized for treating soldiers as interchangeable parts, actually provided critical capability to maintain unit strength during extended operations. When companies took casualties, replacements arrived within days. These soldiers might lack experience, but they were adequately trained, properly equipped, and motivated. German replacement system by 1945 had effectively collapsed. Units fought until destroyed, then were disbanded or merged with other formations. The continuous erosion of veteran personnel meant that German divisions, even prestigious formations like Das Reich, were shadows of their earlier capabilities. Medical care represented another American advantage with strategic implications. American wounded received immediate attention from trained medics, rapid evacuation to field hospitals, and sophisticated surgical treatment that saved lives German medical services could not preserve. Soldiers who knew that wounds would receive proper treatment fought. With confidence absent among troops who understood that serious injury likely meant death or permanent disability. This psychological factor, difficult to quantify but undeniably real, contributed to American tactical aggressiveness. The political dimensions of Patton's unauthorized crossing extended to domestic American politics and inter-Allied relations. Patton was extraordinarily popular with American public opinion, carefully cultivated through media attention that emphasized his aggressive leadership and colorful personality. This popularity provided protection against official censure that other commanders would not have enjoyed. Eisenhower could not relieve Patton without creating public controversy regardless of military justification. This political reality influenced decision-making throughout the chain of command. British reactions to Oppenheim were complex and reflected ongoing tensions about American military competence and appropriate roles within Allied command structure. Montgomery's careful preparation for Operation Plunder represented British military culture, emphasizing thorough planning and minimizing casualties. Patton's success before Montgomery crossed seemed to validate American criticism of British caution. British military leadership publicly praised Patton's achievement while privately questioning whether similar results could have been achieved through proper planning without accepting unnecessary risk. Soviet reactions to Western Allied operations in spring 1945 focused primarily on ensuring maximum territorial gains before Germany's collapse. Stalin wanted Western allies to remain west of previously agreed demarcation lines. Rapid American advances threatened to complicate post-war settlement negotiations. Soviet military leadership respected Patton's operational capabilities while viewing him as dangerously aggressive and potentially unpredictable. The political complications that would define Cold War were already emerging even as coalition partners were winning World War II. The immediate strategic consequence of Oppenheim was acceleration of German collapse in Western regions. Patton's success created a bridgehead that Third Army exploited with characteristic speed. Within days, American armored columns were driving deep into southern Germany, bypassing strongpoints, encircling German formations, and capturing territory at rates that approached mechanized pursuit rather than deliberate offensive operations. German forces attempting to maintain coherent defensive lines found their positions turned by American penetrations that moved faster than German formations could reposition to counter them. This operational tempo created cascading effects throughout German defensive structure. Units ordered to hold positions found themselves isolated as American advances bypassed them. Formations attempting to retreat to secondary positions were intercepted by American armor moving along parallel routes. The systematic destruction of German railway network through air interdiction meant that large-scale troop movements were nearly impossible. German forces in western regions faced strategic situation with no viable solutions. They could defend and be destroyed in place, or retreat and be destroyed while moving. German civilian population in areas being overrun experienced this collapse with mixture of relief and terror. Years of Nazi propaganda had created expectations of brutal treatment by occupying forces. The reality, particularly with American troops, was generally far less harsh than propaganda predicted. American soldiers were under strict orders regarding treatment of civilians, and military government quickly established administrative structures. Food supplies, though limited, were distributed. Medical care was provided. While occupation was never pleasant, it was dramatically better than what German civilians had been led to expect. The discovery of concentration camps by advancing American forces transformed soldier attitudes toward German population and military. Third Army units liberated multiple camps in early April as they drove through southern Germany. Soldiers who witnessed conditions in these facilities developed hatred toward Germans that affected subsequent conduct. The restraint that had characterized much of the war's final months eroded when confronted with evidence of systematic atrocity. German prisoners were still treated according to Geneva Conventions but with hardness absent earlier in the campaign. For Das Reich specifically, Oppenheim marked the beginning of final destruction. The division never recovered from losses sustained during the crossing. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.